Welcome, everybody. Everybody's found the chat box now. Introductions pouring in. Okay, so numbers look like they're stabilizing. So I think we're going to get things going. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction before I hand over to our first speaker. My name's Andrew Sims. I'm the coordinator of the Rapid Transition Alliance, which I work with Professor Peter Newell, who you'll be hearing from in a moment on. I am co-director of an organization called the New Weather Institute, and I've been involved in these things over quite a while. Wrote the original Green New Deal with colleagues about 12 years ago. Today's session, though, is what I think we're seeing, certainly from the media reaction to it, is hopefully going to be a bit of a groundbreaking report from the Cambridge Sustainability Commission on Scaling Behaviour Change. It's making one or two very simple sort of big headline points that there's been an overlooked emphasis on tackling the polluter elite and the importance of governments providing low carbon alternatives for low income households. But importantly, it looks at in the context of the current moment of COVID-19, which has demonstrated the capacity, not just for our own behavior change, but for the responses of governments to sort of overturn or go beyond measures, policy measures, financing measures, which have previously been considered as barriers. I just want to mention one or two rules of engagement for this afternoon. Again, nothing fancy, but please feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves. Lots of people are doing so. Any affiliated organizations, why you're interested in the topic even of sustainable behavior change. For questions, we're asking people to use the Q&A function and not the chat function for that, as we'll use this as a way of grouping the questions thematically for the panel discussion later. And in order to get to help us winnow through the questions, please use the upvoting system for questions, and that will help us avoid duplication as well. Now, if you've got questions for specific panelists, and I imagine people will, please preface your question in the Q&A box with their name, for example, Manisha or Stuart, and we'll do our best to cluster those and feed back to the panel. Please feel free to share relevant links and literature in the chat function. That always helps, and we will be saving the chat later. Now, obviously, we well know now the physics of the relativity of time. We know that gravity can bend it. We also know that public speaking on Zoom can bend it too. But all our speakers are thoroughly professional, so I know they're going to stick to their 5 minutes. We're going to hear in order from Johan Rockström, from Peter Newell, Lewis Akenji, Stuart Capstick, Manisha, Anantharaman, and Juliet Shaw. But we're going to start off with a few words of introduction from Professor Johan Rockström, who is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and professor in Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam. He's probably bored of being reminded of this now, but he was part of the team who gave us coined for us the planetary boundaries framework, and I see that he has published well over 100 research articles. So if you want fun in the questions later, you can ask him questions from very early research articles and see if he remembers what he wrote. I'm going to hand it over to Johan for a few introductory remarks. 5 minutes worth from you, Rohan, now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and wonderful to be here with you all. And I think we, on this call, would agree on the following statement, that if there's something that science agrees upon, it is that we have reached a transformative moment. This is the decisive decade for humanity's future on Earth for centuries to come. This is the moment when we need to halve global emissions over the next 9 years. This is the moment we need to halt loss of nature. We need a transition towards sustainability. What we don't agree on the other hand, is the means to get there. And the holy grail is really to understand how far can we scale the pace of behavioral change among communities in all different societies across the world. That was the heart of the idea from the KR Foundation of launching the first behavioral change commission to do a scientific assessment of what do we know today on scalable behavioral change opportunities for a transition to a sustainable future. The journal Global Sustainability at Cambridge University Press at the same time wanted to basically copying the Lancet Commission success of launching and establishing a Cambridge Sustainability Commission. And we saw this to be the grand opportunity to take this holy grail question of scalable behavioral change and do that in the form of a Cambridge Sustainability Commission. I would like to congratulate you for the phenomenally important report that you've produced. I think you've really addressed and laid out an assessment on the scalability options of behavioral change. I think one of your overarching conclusions that to achieve this transition requires a scale, a pace of change across all points within a society. So it's not only about individual behavioral change, it's equally about economic policies, infrastructure, income, and shifts in supply and demand. I think this is really a starting point for an inquiry towards solution in this whole transformative space. So from the KR Foundation and on behalf of the Global Sustainability Journal, just congratulating you to have come to this point and looking forward to stand on this report in looking for the options to really scale the pace of change that you have concluded is possible if we start implementing. Back to you, Andrew.
Johan, thank you so much for getting us off to a good start and for working within your allotted 5 minutes, which means maybe about another 30 seconds each from my other fellow speakers. Now we're going to hear next from Professor Peter Newell, and I should also say that all the report and all the materials related to it are on the Rapid Transition Alliance website, and the Rapid Transition Alliance website is also a sort of source of many examples that demonstrate how the kinds of behavior changes that we're talking about and that are important are indeed possible and already happening in many places around the world. The Rapid Transition Alliance was conceived of jointly by Professor Peter Newell and myself a few years ago to demonstrate these possibilities. And it's just wonderful now to see the level of interest in this. In fact, Peter said earlier this morning before he started his mad round of media interviews, he said with a slight smile of surprise, I wasn't expecting them to be this interested. So it's a message to us all to have the courage of our convictions, and perhaps the world is now ready to hear these kind of messages. And so with that, and with a minute in hand, I'm going to hand over to Peter. Peter.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thank you also to Professor Rockström for those kind opening remarks and helping us to set the scene for today's discussion. And also, of course, want to thank the 31 commissioners that contributed to this report with their advice and suggestions about case studies and literatures and useful tipping points and intervention points for trying to drive this agenda forward. We're hugely grateful for your inputs and expertise. And thank you really to all of you for joining us today. We're again overwhelmed by the scale of the reaction. We've had over 500 people sign up for the webinar today, and as Andrew was alluding to just now, we've had huge amounts of ongoing media interest. So clearly it seems there's an appetite for this conversation, however difficult it might be. But people are keen to think about how we might change our ways, particularly perhaps in light of the COVID crisis and the need to build back better and to build back differently, and the role of behaviour change within that. And I think really that context of the COVID moment, which ran through the course of us doing this work, really places those questions of behaviour change alongside the need to rewire the economy front and centre. So just very briefly, a word on the Commission. Many of the commissioners are on this session today, the 31 of them. And you'll see from that list there's a mixture of leading experts on sustainable behaviour change, as well as practitioners doing the frontline work of behaviour change. People from different disciplines. This was one of our key criteria. We wanted people from psychology, sociology, science and technology studies, economics, and natural scientists. But we also wanted regional representation. And so you can see from that list there's people from Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, and North America. And basically what we asked commissioners to do was to suggest key areas of research, literature that we should be engaging with, to propose concrete case studies and examples about the possibility of scaling change, and to identify some of the gaps in knowledge and practice. And so it's clearly the case that this issue is moving out from the margins, as this slide here suggests. Clearly, shifts in policy, service provision, technological innovation are all hugely important, but so too, and this is becoming increasingly obvious, are far-reaching changes in lifestyles if we're to avoid the most dangerous forms of global heating and get anywhere near the Paris targets. So after this long period of neglect, the question of behaviour change and scaling behaviour change in particular is very much to the fore. And this has come about through increasing attention from the IPCC, but also the UNEP emissions gap report, which had the chapter on behaviour change, which I know some of you contributed to. So the challenge now is around the scale of this challenge of behaviour change and the different issues that brings to the fore, which we have to wrestle with and which we try to wrestle with in the report. So let me just briefly pull out a few of the key lessons from this report, which I wrote with Freddie Daly and Michelle Twenner, who are both on the call and will be helping with the questions and maybe answering the questions hopefully later on as well. So first key point and theme that we raise, having acknowledged the scale of the challenge, which you can see in these graphics here, is around individual and system change and the fact that they go together and reinforce one another. So for so long in the debate, there's been this sort of polarization and this unhelpful binary about it's either what individuals and households do, or no, it's about the system and individual behaviour change is irrelevant. What we're trying to do in this report, picking up on what others have done, is link the two much more systematically and think more holistically about the links between the two. And really about the cycles of reciprocity is what we talk about in the report, between some of those things that you can see there on that graphic, to try and push more transformative action and more ambitious action to try and tackle climate change. And so we try to take this slightly more empowering view of behaviour change than just the focus on individuals and households and what they do. Secondly, we put a strong emphasis on what we call one planet living, and this comes back a little bit to what Johan was talking about in relation to planetary boundaries. Clearly, or it's clear to us and to most of the commissioners, I think, that we have no chance of reaching the Paris goals just through conventional strategies of nudging and individualizing responsibility without tackling the underlying drivers of unsustainable consumption. So we need to socialize the idea of limits, respecting ecological limits, being liberal in our politics about how we achieve and live within these limits, but not liberal with the limits themselves. So we talk a lot about shrink and share, again, borrowing language that others have developed. How do we set realistic budgets to keep within Paris timeframe, but then share equitably within and across societies remaining carbon space? And of course, this means for this to be a just and fair process, something I'll come on to in a moment, it needs to involve citizens far more proactively and inclusively than has been the case before. And it also means tackling the sources of overconsumption, questions of advertising, the normalisation and reification of high carbon lifestyles, and some important work, for example, that Andrew and colleagues have been doing, and Leo, who I think is also on this session, on badvertising and badverts and rolling back their power and influence. So third key theme is around just transitions. Clearly, any attempt to transform behaviours has to start with a recognition of the glaring inequalities between rich and poor within and across societies. And so as a minimum, efforts to scale behaviour change need to address these questions of justice and certainly not entrench existing inequalities. And so this means putting questions of economic justice at the heart of efforts to scale behaviour change, to reduce inequality on the one hand, but also to rein in the behaviour of what we've called, borrowing Dario Kenna, one of our commissioners' phrase, the polluter elite, which is the framing that a lot of the media have run with today, interestingly. And so we talk about key intervention points that create enabling environments for dealing with these issues, things like low-cost electric vehicle bus provision, properly insulated homes, to help address questions of energy poverty, as well as reduce emissions simultaneously, and in a global context, what Manisha and colleagues refer to as lifestyle leapfrogging. Fourth key issue we raise is around governing change and enabling a power shift. Basically what we're arguing here, that we won't get this sort of transformational change unless we actively challenge, contest and roll back incumbent power, the control that powerful beneficiaries of the existing system have over our politics. And that does mean creating new political spaces of representation, hence the image there of this Climate Assembly in the UK, and there's clearly other experiments trying to do similar sorts of things, but also seriously taking money out of politics around party donations, directorships, closing revolving doors that exist between powerful incumbent actors and our rulers. These things are part of the picture in trying to move society in a more sustainable direction. And then we talk about transforming society by deep scaling. And so here we're trying to push beyond dominant approaches to scaling, which emphasize numbers of people, but often in quite a decontextualized way, obscuring questions of responsibility and agency and where it lies. So it's all about size, reach and rollout, but often falls into the scalar trap of assuming that what works in one place will necessarily work elsewhere. And so we contrast approaches to shallow scaling, which are about mainstreaming without disrupting key trends, with deeper scaling, which is about value shifts and deeper cultural transformations, which help to get to the root causes of overconsumption. Behaviour hotspots, again, there's more and more attention to this in the literature, as many of you will know. We need to focus on key areas like aviation, food and housing, and the potential gains, as you can see from this figure, are potentially enormous. And just to sort of take one other example, because people are in the media coverage today are mainly talking about things like aviation, it's only between 2 and 4% of the global population flew in 2018. So there's this sense in which we're all flying and it's going to be really hard to roll this back. It's actually a tiny, tiny minority globally that are engaging in some of the most impactful forms of behaviour. And even just 1% of the population was responsible for 50% of CO2 from commercial aviation. So we need to hone in on specific social groups and specific social behaviours. So final point, this is where we get into this discussion about tipping points and the cycles of reciprocity between the different actors that we talk about in the reports, and thinking about how can we amplify and accelerate this process of change by forging new alliances with actors that are often not so central or haven't been to date in relation to behaviour change debates, working with intermediary organisations, those that have a powerful influence over key consumption choices at key moments in our lives. And of course, there's a huge opportunity for the funding community to be involved in working as incubators, as connectors, and as mobilisers. And that part of the report looks in much more detail at the concrete things that we think the funding community can do to try and support all of this. So to wrap up, here are the resources. You can find out more about the different elements of the report, and there's videos and other resources. Basically, we're saying the debate on behaviour change needs to move on. We need an account, we think, that's much more political and social, that brings in questions of power and justice to the fore far more centrally, so that we get clarity over these questions of responsibility and agency. And this in turn can lead to a far more holistic understanding of behaviour change and its potential as one part of what we call an ecosystem of transformation. But it implies going beyond nudges and tools and the current approaches that we're often using to try and change behaviours towards thinking more seriously about a shift of power. And it's then, and under those sorts of circumstances, that we continue to be optimistic that we can face up to this challenge. So thank you all again, and please dive into the report when you get a chance, and do give us your feedback, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That's a fantastic whirlwind tour of all the materials. And I would be negligent if I didn't mention, in terms of amplifying change, that if you're not already, your organization is not already a member of the Rapid Transition Alliance, then do please join. You can join directly through rapidtransition.org, and maybe I'll post the link into the chat function later. And in that way, we can share and amplify each other's examples of work demonstrating the possibilities of change. Now we're going to move on and hear next from Dr. Lewis Akenji, who's going to be talking a little bit about the scale of the challenge of what it means to try and get to a 1.5 degree compatible lifestyle, some of the challenges involved in that. Now, Lewis is Managing Director of the Hot or Cool Institute, a member of the Rapid Transition Alliance, an organization that brings together ideas from both science and practice to underpin solutions towards more future sustainable societies. Now, he was one of the authors of another recent landmark report on 1.5 degree compatible lifestyles. And Lewis is going to talk to us for about 5 minutes on that. So over to you, Lewis.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And thank you very much, Peter, for introducing the report before. And of course, to Johan, not only because the KR Foundation funded the 1.5 degree lifestyles report, but also for championing work around this area. You talked about behavior change being the holy grail question of how we scale to solutions. And one way of imagining this is what happened last year. After being locked indoors all year, after being unable to go visit our neighbors and do all the things that we're used to doing, at the end of the year, we get released a report telling us we only reduced our emissions by 7%. And so everyone goes, with all that suffering, it was only 7%. Now, that is the scale we should keep in mind. And that is why we should start asking ourselves, what is it that we need to start giving up? But not only giving up, what is it that we need to start regenerating to find new ways of doing things? A lot of this is contained in the 1.5 degree lifestyles report. And perhaps to put it in context, lifestyles have really been a hot potato issue up until fairly recently for individuals, because of course their lifestyles are linked to identity, to their identity and to the dream of what success or what we've calibrated success to be, but also to governments from democratic countries, because they feel like addressing lifestyles is actually interfering in a private sphere, which is not necessarily seen as the mandate of governments. A side note here that governments always tend to forget what their mandate is when it comes to doing big things. That aside, in the 1.5 degree lifestyle report, we asked the question of what is the potential contribution of lifestyle changes in meeting the aspirational target of the Paris Agreement, in this case, 1.5 degrees. And the unit we use is the lifestyle carbon footprint. This is consumption from households and individuals, emissions from consumption that are directly induced by households and individuals, but not including capital formation and government expenditure. So this comes really close to lifestyles as much as possible. And what we find is, given the current budget we have to stay below 1.5, we need to move from about 4.6 tons of CO2 equivalents per person per year to about 2.5 tons in 2030 and to about 0.7 tons in 2050. If you do the quick math around there, we need to reduce, if you are in Finland where you're at about 10.4 tons, or in Japan where you're at about 7.6, you need to see a reduction in lifestyle carbon footprint of about 90% per person per year. That is the scale of transitioning we're talking about. And that is what becomes very frightening. This is not the case only with industrialized countries like Japan and Finland. Also, other countries we looked at, India, China, and Brazil, already, in comparison to where they need to be in 2050, already need to start thinking about reductions upwards of 30%. And these are countries that have hundreds of millions of people that still need to come out of poverty. Now, talking of poverty, one of the underlying things that we get in the report is the degree of inequity that we see in the distributions here. The US, for example, has about 10 times the emissions related to consumption for an average citizen of India. Not only are we seeing these differences between countries, we're seeing it within countries, including the rich countries. If you've been following the news, at some point, while about 40 million Americans were filing for bankruptcy in the United States during the COVID lockdown or the pandemic, the wealth of billionaires went up by about $500 billion. This is really the level of disparity we are talking about. So the question becomes, what sort of instruments or what sort of tools do we use that make sure we're not only living within ecological limits, but that everyone has access to opportunity, or that the burden is equally shared? This is where we start thinking about aspects such as choice editing, carbon rationing, and the wild areas in our minds that we never thought we would go to until recently. If you've experienced anything over the last 2 years, that is scary. Now, just because we're talking about lifestyles, the illusion is usually that it is just individuals that need to change. And this is really where the false dichotomy between whether it is individual change or systemic change becomes quite important. While we've seen a lot of grassroots innovation, while we've seen a lot of individual behavior change, especially in the key areas of mobility, nutrition, and how we heat or cool our houses, we're also seeing that there's limited agency being experienced by these individuals. So the question becomes, what type of systemic change do we need that accompanies this individual change? And in talking about this, we need to start thinking about areas of investment in infrastructure. What sort of infrastructure are we laying down now? And how would it lock people into particular modes of consumption over the next 10 to 50 years? We need to start reviewing those. But we also need to look at the choice architecture, the provisioning systems that allow us to get to meet our needs or the goods that we need for everyday living. And last but not least, a question about the power dynamics, the political economy of consumption and lifestyles. Who really has the power? Who is driving the patterns that we see? And what sort of interventions can we get those that are presently not allies in this huge challenge to cross over? while we shape a future sustainable society. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, Lewis. That's another tour de force and explains why there's such a focus in the report on the importance of tackling what is being dubbed a polluter elite. Now, one of the other big issues in this debate, of course, is that for such a long time, it's been the case that when you even mention behavior change, people will very often respond and say, but isn't it about the system? So we're going to hear next from Dr. Stuart Capstick on the tension, the balance, and the perhaps false dichotomies between system and behavior change. Now, Dr. Stuart Capstick is a research fellow in the School of Psychology at the University of Cardiff, and he works within the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, that's the CAST Centre, and he was one of the co-authors of Chapter 6 in the 2020 UN Emissions Gap Report as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Hello, everyone. Just a quick note to mention as well that with perfect timing, a new pneumatic drill has been going off outside my house. So if please do let me know if that's making me inaudible. Yeah, so as Andrew says, I was asked to say something on the sort of the distinction between individual action versus system change. And I wanted to, first of all, building on Lewis's comments about the sort of the scale of lifestyle change needed to keep within 1.5 degrees, never mind 2 degrees. I'd like to ask, how easy is it to live a low carbon life? And it's not, at least not for many people in the global north. So for example, parts of my house are badly insulated, meaning that heat escapes from it. I can't travel very far without a car because of the dire state of public transport in the UK. So the point becomes we won't get behavior and lifestyle change unless we also get change in the systems that lock us into our high carbon ways. And I think this argument is becoming pretty familiar by now. But for me, this is where the argument starts, not finishes, because we won't get that system change unless it's driven by a critical mass of people making it happen. We can't rely on policymakers or the business elite to sort this out for us. And we can't rely that they'll be persuaded to do the right thing by campaigners or by academics. Now, one way in which wider system change happens, of course, is through citizens getting involved in politics and activism. And this is rightly highlighted in the report. But another way is more subtle and invisible. And that's through a shift in our cultures and our expectations, which are in turn driven by the choices and the participation of all of us. So I think it's really important to understand how our actions can be part of a transition, not isolated behaviors, not individual at all, that we're influenced by other people and by wider society. And at the same time, we have the ability to affect other people's actions and the nature of that society. So I think the only way we'll get truly transformational systemic change is by enough people being part of a collective shift in how we do things that becomes that change. Now, having said that, we shouldn't be naive or simplistic about this. Of course, a few people taking up cycling or drinking oat milk isn't going to cause oil companies to shut down overnight. And absolutely, some people have more power than others. And these are also likely to be the ones who have higher carbon footprints, as is pointed out in the report. But we shouldn't dismiss the power of everyday action either. I think that arguing for systemic change whilst not participating in it is a bit like the person sat in a traffic jam complaining about all the cars on the roads. So the idea that we are passive individuals at the mercy of circumstance ironically plays into the worst the system has to offer, that we just work, consume, die without being part of making change happen. Now, I do think it's hard to find the language and the ideas to express how our personal actions interact with the whole, which is why there is so often this debate on behavior change versus system change, when in reality they're completely intertwined. And the report makes a really useful distinction here, I think, between different types of scaling up of behavior change. So as Peter mentioned, and as is actually summarized in the report in a nice table on page 24. So at a shallow level, people can be nudged into being greener. You can do things like get them to change their shopping habits. And this is useful, we should do it, but it may well leave more fundamental problems intact. At a deeper level is where changes in behaviors and values and norms become part of a more profound cultural shift. So changing perspectives and norms around civil rights, for example, in the past is one case in which that's happened. And I think something equivalent is sorely needed in the context of the climate crisis. And finally, as is outlined in the report, in a positive spiral of change, action in one area helps to reinforce or enable change in another, which can bring about a virtuous cycle. So to give an example, if there are ways to encourage fewer people to fly and to push back against a culture of frequent flying, this opens up the space for policies like a frequent flyer levy and makes the halt to airport expansion more feasible, which in turn can reduce levels of flying and so on. So I think one of the best hopes we have is to find ways to push that self-reinforcing spiral of change that links together individuals and the system in that way.
Fantastic, Stuart. Thank you so much. And if you don't already follow Stuart on Twitter, you really should do. And you'll discover if you do that, that he's so committed to the bringing together of system and behavior change that he changed his name by deed poll on Twitter to reflect that reality. And I like his reference to the classic analogy about the fact that you are not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. And this is an issue for all of us to reflect on. So now we're going to move on to Dr. Manisha Anantharaman. To put some of this debate in the context of the challenges facing the global south, and with regard to the other much talked about idea of the potential for leapfrogging dirty lifestyles, if you like, or sort of heavily polluting lifestyles, and how that touches on issues of social justice. So Manisha, over to you.
Thank you. So thanks, everyone. And so building on what both Stuart and Lewis said, so I think the first thing to note is that the current system, the status quo, actually isn't working for most people in the world. So if you think of the fact that millions today are in poverty or leading lives of precarity, and you take into account the fact also that our current systems of production and consumption create these sacrifice zones, whether those are frontline communities here in my backyard of the Bay Area, living next to fossil fuel extraction, or communities in the global south who are manufacturing the consumption goods, often in very exploitative and dangerous working conditions. What we're currently doing is not necessarily achieving or enhancing the well-being of the majority of the world's population. So if we start from that recognition, I think it offers us an opportunity to nuance and expand the conversation on behavior change beyond the usual suspects. And here, I think the challenge for us as researchers, but also as practitioners, is to avoid the performative behavior trap, which is to focus our attention exclusively on small consumer actions and various forms of virtue signaling, but instead thinking of behavior change as this expansive agenda that bridges the individual, the collective, and the systemic, and really involves changing everyday life alongside changing structures of power and our politics, something that feminist economists and geographers have brought our attention to for a long time now. So in the context of the global south, where, as Lewis mentioned, we have millions of people who still need to improve their standard of living, who need to consume more and who need to emit more carbon, we also have an opportunity to think about how can we create enabling environments to facilitate, incentivize, and lock in low carbon, sustainable ways of living from the outset. Something that my colleague Patrick Schroeder and I call lifestyle leapfrogging. So to give you a simple example, and going back to the question of traffic in the city of Bengaluru, India, where I do a lot of my work, we have an opportunity to design cities in a manner that privileges pedestrian, non-motorized, and public transit, as opposed to the current mode of urban planning, which privileges individualized car usage. So whether that's a low-cost or free bus fleet, whether that's developing sidewalks, as well as other ways for people to get around in the city that are safe. Currently, pedestrian deaths and injuries are a significant proportion of the road-based accidents in a city like Bengaluru. Then something like that is both going to bring benefits for the populations within that city who are currently the most marginalized and the most ill-served by the dominant logics of urban planning, growth, and consumption, while also enabling us to cut back on our resource footprints. So I definitely think there's an opportunity here and an appetite, because again, a majority of the world's population does not actively benefit from the way things are right now.
That's fantastic, Manisha. Thank you so much. And what I should have said was that Dr. Manisha Anantharaman is Associate Professor in Justice, Community and Leadership at St. Mary's College of California. And the reason I cut to her comments so quickly is because, like Stuart, next door to my house at the moment is a building site, and I'm getting my comments in between some very loud hammering, and I managed to get away with it that time. So thank you so much, Manisha. Now, next, before we go into more of a discussion mode, we're going to hear from Juliet Shaw, who is Professor of Sociology at Boston College, previously at Harvard University. She wrote a classic book in 2011 on true wealth in the new economy, and more recently she's published a book on plenitude. Now, Julia's interests overlap very much some of my own, to do with work and income and how we redefine prosperity within the planetary boundaries that Johan is famous for defining earlier. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Juliet.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I just want to express my appreciation for the commission and the report. It's a really wonderful piece of work. And in particular, the bridging of the individual structural divide, I think, is fantastic. So I want to talk about the crucial linkage between household consumption and the labor market. We live in an integrated system. Production and consumption are the two sides of this system. And for most households, their connection to the production system is through the labor market, which is why I think the best way to reduce household consumption for those households who actually are connected to the labor market and to reduce their consumption footprints is via a shift to shorter hours working schedules. So this is a really key and I think underappreciated dimension of how we scale behavioral change. Why? Well, for all but the richest households, their incomes come primarily from work, and income is the enabler of consumption. Most income is consumed. This varies a bit by country, it varies a bit by life cycle, and by income level, but in general, the flow of income through the system is what drives the flow of consumption. So we need to think about scaling behavior change by integrating labor market concerns into our thinking. So this perspective implies that while changing what people consume is very important, in wealthy countries, an equally important issue is changing how much people consume. And I think too much of our discussion has been about the what and not enough about the how much. So to discuss the how much, we need to think about altering the flow of income into the economy and over time, the growth of income. And one of the things we know is that when people decide to work less, they generally spend less, they have lower carbon footprints. And I've done a lot of research looking at this at the macro level, so across countries, but also across states within countries. Shorter hours are correlated with lower emissions. Now, there are a number of ways we can reduce work time through national policies. I think some of there are exciting things going on in Europe, the Spanish pilot for a 4-day work week. I'm involved in studying a pilot that we're going to be starting in the fall in Ireland for a 4-day work week. The key mechanism is taking productivity growth in the form of shorter hours rather than expanding output. Voluntary work time reduction for higher income households is also a really important pathway to reducing footprints. And instead of pushing more people into the workforce, which has been the trend recently, enabling earlier retirement. So I want to suggest that the idea of sort of powering down, which of course we have in the energy systems discourses, is also key for understanding sort of the larger culture and the culture of work. And here I think that, at least in my own country, which is the US, the younger generation is really leading the way. They've gotten very active on shorter work time, pushing for 4-day work weeks. And one of the things this suggests is that shorter work time is a really major benefit that can help offset the sort of giving up and sacrifice dimensions that much of the sort of 1.5 lifestyles or one planet living, et cetera, visions, I think, really raise for many households. So finally, to make this work at the national level, we also need to think, we need to integrate redistribution of income and wealth, both to make it possible for more people to work shorter hours, but also because rising inequality is part of what has been fueling longer hours of work as people desperately try to keep up with those higher in the distribution. We know that consumer standards, expectations, what people feel they need, is a highly socially relative phenomenon. What we consider adequate, comfortable, and luxurious is all socially driven. So the report, really nicely includes work time. I think, one of the things I'm hoping for out of the sort of the fact that this discussion is really heating up is that we do a lot more to integrate work schedules and shorter work time pathways into this conversation.
Juliet, thank you so much, and such a professional. It looks like she timed her 5-minute contribution to perfection. That was wonderful. And I've often thought, actually, that I'm, very often whenever we discuss the scale of the challenge, what is the single biggest thing that could enable us to begin making the shift? And of course, it's time and resources. And I think the shorter working week, it's very interesting how that has moved up the political agenda. And when you add that to the rising interest in the debate around what might underpin it in terms of various forms of universal basic income or access to universal basic services, then you can begin to see the foundations from which processes of change might happen. Right now, what we're going to do for the next few minutes is just have a little bit of a quick discussion amongst our panelists, and I hope very much to bring in Johan and Peter from the original contributions to join our other 4 speakers. And I'm going to pick off 1 or 2 of the more popular questions which people have been asking in the Q&A box, and I'm going to put three questions to you, and then we'll still around, give each of you a chance to respond to whichever of them you feel moved to respond to. Now, the first one is the classic. It's about, does small bits of individual change add up to much? Does it hold us back? And is the approach in much of civil society and the campaigning world of incrementalism a sort of an expression of that old habit of not believing in the sort of paradigm shift or bust, which is my own mantra when it comes to trying to change the world? So that's that one question about how do we deal with the ingrained sort of individualism and incrementalism of the process of change on the one hand. The second question is around the role of broader awareness and how we can make this a much wider cultural movement beyond the sort of specialized language that we use within the sector. And finally, about the role of aspirations and having new role models, and where are these going to come from? How, if it's often been said, if I cannot see it, I cannot be it. From where are we going to draw our new aspirational role models if we're going to leapfrog some of the other dirty ways of doing things? And I think what I might do is, if we are all still here, is maybe go back to Peter, and then we'll hear from Johan, and then we can sort of cycle around our speakers in the first order, and then we'll reverse it for the next round. So over to you, Peter. You can come back on camera. Wonderful.
Great, thanks very much for those fantastic interventions. So yeah, this is the perennial question: does it add up to much? And I guess what we're saying here is that many of the approaches are clearly not working. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on the sort of trajectory that we're on at the moment. We need something else, which is much more about the spiraling, the cycles of reciprocity, as we talk about it in the report, trying to stitch those links between individual and system change. Inevitably, in the moment, things always seem incremental, but I guess what's also interesting, and the COVID moment has shown this, things can spiral very, very quickly, and more rapid change is possible than you would have imagined. And the COVID moment, to some extent, has shown that. Who would have believed that governments would be willing to repurpose whole industries and get vacuum cleaner producers to start making ventilators and things like this. So moments of crisis or opportunities allow things to change often quite rapidly and quickly. And so things can accelerate from being quite incremental to being more disruptive over quite short periods of time. And they often come from surprising places. Again, who would have thought that the UK government under a Tory administration would be phasing out the internal combustion engine by 2030, and that was quite a surprising maneuver. So these things do bubble up. But I think in terms of accelerating them and scaling them, we do need to think more innovatively and build the sorts of alliances that we talk about in the report, but also deal with those underlying structural things, which I think Juliet and Manisha and others have been talking about, getting to the roots of economic injustice and inequalities, because if we don't root those out, we have no possible basis of building a more sustainable economy.
That's great, Peter, and a really interesting reflection on how the borders of what is possible fundamentally shift when there's a big external shock to the economy. I find it quite amusing that our own government has been telling us that there's no magic money tree after introducing one after the financial crisis in 2008 and magically being able to create billions and billions of pounds, hundreds of billions of pounds worth of money to stimulate the economy, with even more the case in the US. So, perhaps one of the questions, it's a bit unfair to add these, but I'm going to throw in another one to Lewis to reflect upon those three, is now that we've had these demonstrations of radical shifts about how, for example, the state can become the wage payer of last resort overnight in order to support the economy, and how we're able to adopt new behaviors in terms of social distancing, etc., virtually overnight. So I suppose one extra question from those lessons is, what can we do, Lewis, to help these things take root, this sort of understanding of the belief in the possibility of these much larger scale paradigm shift type changes? Lewis.
I wish I had an answer to that. I'd be sipping champagne somewhere in the rooftop garden right now, but I'll try. I'll start from the first part. Do individual actions really make a difference? The answer is yes, they do. And they do add up, especially when you address the consequential areas. And most people, when you hear of the political elites, you're probably thinking of someone who is not in this call. The likelihood that you're one of them, that we're all part of the political elites is really very high. Part of the problem here is we've summarized the range of options within the marketplace. So we're only looking for efficiency measures, for example. We're only looking at income-related measures, for example. We're only looking at reducing externalities related to trade flows, for example. There is a huge part of society that is living well and within limits that we're not protecting. What are we doing? We're selling an economic model to them that would shift them out of their sustainable zone into areas where they start consuming like us, having work contracts like us, and so on. And after that, we tell them, now you got to go back to being sustainable, even with the knowledge of how difficult it is, right? So one of the starting, the problem with the individual approach and the limits of it is just that, while it creates a momentum, it creates acceptability of drastic solutions and major changes that need to take place, it is not happening at the pace that is desired. So what can we do to accelerate it? And this links to the third question. I would say the role of institutions has not been properly explored in this conversation. Institutions are essentially those that give us permission to act in one way or another, who say, these are the norms, these are the procedures we should follow, these are the laws, these are the ways that we should act that are permitted or not permitted. If we can envision a future that operates differently from what we have now, we should start thinking of different institutions from the ones we have now. We have a lot of institutions, what is called institutional stickiness, that is holding us back from this kind of a transition. Primarily, not because they're intended to, but because they're founded, and it is in the nature of them to hold back so we can do work in the way that they profit from it. How about beginning to change our institutions as well as how they're influencing individual behavior change and governance?
That's wonderful, Lewis, and I can certainly think of a few what you might call sticky institutions that I'm still looking for an ecologically friendly cleaning agent to deal with. Let's go now to Stuart, and I start the same with you, Stuart. Any particular thoughts or reflections on how we can get some of these demonstrated abilities for radical policy and behavior change, which we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months, to stick?
Yeah, I'm going to go and sip champagne on a rooftop with Lewis if I can answer that question as well. I mean, it's hard to know, isn't it? We don't know whether when lockdown ends, if it ever ends, whether we will just go back to quote normal, or whether we will have learned something. 10 years ago with the financial crisis, there was a lot of reflection, Occupy Wall Street and so on. We were going to have new ways of living and all the rest of it. And did that happen? I don't know. I think what we can do is to try to consolidate and cement the more, I mean, I always hesitate to say the positive things that have come out of something which involves such a huge amount of misery, but the more positive things that have come out of COVID, like being able to sort of spend more time in our communities, for some people working at home, connection to nature and so on. If we can consolidate those sorts of things and reject the things that we didn't want in our lives, then that's good. I think on the point about sort of demonstrating change and that Peter reflects on it, it's really hard to know whether the sort of whether behaviors or lifestyle changes that you might be able to enable are going to be able to spiral upwards and lead to some sort of virtuous cycle of change, or whether they are ultimately just a bit incremental and distracting and pointless and simple and painless. And there's a quote from David McKay, who was a government scientific advisor a number of years ago, who said, "It's not every little helps, it's every big helps." And I think if we want to focus on behavior change and where we want to focus our attention, we need to be looking at the impactful behaviors, the difficult ones, the rarer ones, the visible ones, the ones that make you feel awkward and that people can see. So rather than switching off phone chargers, we should be having those awkward public conversations about, well, how come you've had 5 flights? Not to pin blame on people, but to shine the light on the things that are impactful and difficult and socially awkward.
That's great, Stuart. And if anybody follows the Flying Less Twitter campaigners, you'll see there's a very good animation about how to have difficult conversations about why you don't fly with people. But I'm going to put the same question again to Manisha, and also sort of throw in this sort of dimension about, it's been said that the struggle against incumbent powers, locked-in powers, is often the struggle of memory against forgetting. So how can we hold in view these possibilities that have been thrown up by necessity in our response to COVID, and those other questions as well? Over to Manisha.
Thank you, Andrew. So to maybe first start on the first question you asked, does individual change matter? I think I'm an ethnographer. I spend a lot of time hanging out with people who are trying to change their everyday lives, their consumption practices, as well as the environments they occupy. And one thing I found is that when people are able to politicize the conditions of their everyday life and recognize that the reason why I am not able to make this choice that is better for me, for my health, for my family, and for the environment has something to do with those institutions that Lewis mentioned, and are able to mobilize collective power to change institutions, great things can happen. And I've have several examples of my own research where I've seen people who have never seen themselves as activists, who don't do activism, for whom that's a kind of a dangerous word, become activists who are trying to shift the levers of kind of institutional processes, social norms, in order to realize a vision of something that they think is good or necessary for themselves, their communities, and the planet. And I think that partially that's a pedagogic process. That's something we do by learning, and we learn by doing. So a big part of, I think, the challenge for us is how can we seed and support those pedagogic processes of politicizing consumption and citizen engagement. And I think what is happening, or our response to COVID, is partially that too, which is how do we also recognize that the ways in which some people have suffered more due to COVID and have required and have demanded support, whether that's in the form of the state or in the form of solidarity networks, is in of itself, it's not a natural disaster, it's not inevitable, but tied to these existing patterns of inequality. And I'm thinking right now about, informal economy workers in India who have been the worst hit by the COVID-19 crises, living already in poverty and precarity, now articulating demands for example, for the recognition of the environmental labor they do perform already, for example, in the waste sector, but also through growing food, through street vending, and asking for recognition and value of their work, but also for policies to change to enable public space to be used as a multi-use space and not just for the enjoyment and recreation or elites, or as a thoroughfare for cars. So I'm also thinking about the ways in which we can take this current crisis and use it as an opportunity to build inclusive, broad-based social movements.
Fantastic, Manisha. Thank you. Now, on to Juliet, and I'm particularly interested in Juliet's reflections on the way in which perhaps one of the trickiest things to change, to create sort of new normals in, has been in patterns of working. And of course, one of the greatest upheavals of the last year or more has been the sort of revolution by force of people having to work from home, working different patterns, governments experimenting with different forms of stepping in to support workplaces financially, because again, by necessity. And I wonder, you've been working on this for years, what you're taking from this about new possibilities, or whether you think it's just going to disappear like the morning dew evaporating as everybody goes back when the vaccination programs have rolled through, or do you think there's something that we can take?
Thank you, Andrew. Can I just start by talking about the individual behavior change question, though, and then I'll come on to yours. So I think what's really important about this is to, first of all, to remember that this has become the strategy of the corporations who don't want anything to change. And I'll give you an anecdote. In the mid-90s, I started, co-founded an organization called the Center for a New American Dream, which was about transforming lifestyles to make them ecologically sustainable. And I was on the metro or our subway up to a board meeting, and I saw these big ads about lifestyle change and, reduce your carbon footprint and this and that. And I was like, wow, we're really making an impact. And as I kept going past these things, I finally noticed something in the bottom right of these beautiful pictures. And it was the corporation that had put these up, and it was Chevron, of course, an oil gas corporation. So I think what we have to remember is individual change is a necessary but not sufficient condition. What the corporations want us to do is to think it's a sufficient condition. So why is it not sufficient, but what role does it have? First of all, the work I've done shows that people who transform their lifestyles are also more likely to be politically active, both because activists transform their lifestyles, but also there's an important group that feels empowered by this change, and they get more active and do more things. And that activism is absolutely foundational for making system change. The second thing is that it creates a kind of personal empowerment for people. And we're doing research on buy nothing groups now, people who are, doing a lot of swapping, gifting, receiving. And an interesting dimension of this is that environmental motives are actually a small part of why people are doing this. And what this suggests is that we have multiple pathways to sort of engage people in this lifestyle change, because consumption is, what we in the academy call polysemic, many meaning. People do it for multiple reasons. And so we can tap into a whole range of motives and cultural trends and so forth that help move us toward lower impact lifestyles. And this is part of why I think time and working hours are so important. I do want to reiterate a point that both Peter and Stuart made in their presentations, which is the importance of those early adopters for transforming markets. We would not have the rash of EV policies now, both from companies and governments, that we have seen in the last year, electric vehicle policies, if there was not a robust early adopter market for these vehicles. So that's a whole other thing about how markets work and how policy moves. Okay, finally, to get to Andrew's question about how the pandemic has affected work patterns, I do think we're seeing an opening here both because of the spatial changes, because of the extreme sort of work-family stress that people have been under during the pandemic, because of the fact that, you know, our economy shut down and we managed basically not spending except on necessities for months. And so there is, I think this is part of why we have seen this uptick in this 4-day work week campaign, which has been going on for a number of years, but it's just this year where we have governments, where we have trade unions, where we have foundations, you know, a whole range of people saying, hey, let's do this, where the young activists that I work with are saying, I'm not going to take a 5-day a week job anymore. I want a 4-day work week. And they're really pushing us, you know, older folks on this. So yeah, I think we have a moment. It doesn't mean it's going to work, but there's the window's cracked open a bit.
That's fascinating, Juliet. Thank you so much. And I think it's very interesting. I'm sitting here in London in the UK, and it was just yesterday that our particular lockdown restrictions changed. And I've been fascinated by the kind of language that has become normal during the lockdown process, the language about unnecessary travel. And it was just yesterday that the so-called non-essential shops were reopened again. And I thought, well, maybe we should hold that and think about those things. The clue is in the name, unnecessary and non-essential, things to think about. Right, we're going to have another round of questions now, which I'm going to put to everybody. I think this time I'm going to start with Pete, and then I'm going to, just to kind of make sure that we keep all our speakers awake, randomly go to our other speakers after Peter so that they're ready with their answers. And you've been voting on your questions. So what I'm doing is drawing from those questions which are coming towards the top of the pile at the moment. I might throw in a couple of extra ones here. Don't feel that you are compelled to answer all of them, but please do as many as you would like. I also delighted in Juliet's remembering of Chevron and the oil companies, and I think the oil companies are probably beaten only in their brazenness and shamelessness by old Etonians, of which we have a lot of experience in this country. But anyway, on to the other questions. Now, one of those questions, which are always great to ask and sometimes horrible to answer, I want you to think about what would be your top 3 actions to move us in the direction of more sustainable behavior. That was one of our questions. We have another about how it is that we can try to move away, I suppose, from the very individualized processes of change, about what can we do to encourage more collective shifts. We have another question about the role of empathy, and empathy underpinning our senses of extended responsibility and giving us perhaps the motivation and the emotional connection that leads to action and change. The 4th question, I said I'd throw in an extra couple, is about how can we increase awareness of the urgency of the process of change that we're facing, and one for the fans of technical policy in this sphere. It's a favorite one. It comes around time and again. How do we depose GDP as our measure of overall economic success? I could go on about that one, but I'm going to restrain myself. And I'm going to start with Peter to pick from those, and then we're going to move around to our other speakers. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you. You froze slightly there, so I didn't catch all of those, but I caught the first one, and I caught the one about urgency and the one about GDP, so I'll sort of try and formulate some response to those. So
that's pretty much most of it.
Okay, so you didn't freeze for too long then. I guess 3 key interventions for me, going back to the thing about starting with economic justice and particularly for poorer groups. I mean, that's really one of the key things we emphasised in the report, and it's tried to bring it out in the media coverage today. It's almost this 2-pronged strategy. There's one thing about reining in the polluter elite, which is about managing their behaviours. It might be around frequent flyer levies, all those sorts of things. But the bigger challenge is really about shifting infrastructures for the rest of the population, which is about affordable, low carbon transportation. It's about proper housing, more energy efficient housing, and so on. So I'd put a big emphasis on housing, proper building regulations, retrofitting of houses, just stop people burning money when they try to just heat their homes. That would be a big thing. Related to that, yeah, affordable transport, viable alternatives, decent, affordable train systems and electric buses would be another big thing. So those are on the infrastructural side. I guess on the supply side, and obviously this is a bit of self-promotion for you and I, Andrew, would be a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So something which left vast majority of remaining fossil fuels in the ground. That would be a game changer in terms of how we accelerate change. So I'll go for that. How do we, was the question about how do we accelerate urgency or raise the profile of questions of urgency? I mean, my sense is people are very aware or increasingly aware of the urgency of the situation. They're just often not sure or don't have enough agency or autonomy to do much about it. And that's where you get this frustration and disempowerment and so on. And I think the outlet for that and what we have to channel people into much more is the mobilization and the pushing back and the asking the awkward questions about why certain groups in society get to claim such a huge proportion and share of the carbon budget. So it's sort of tapping into that anger, frustration, disillusionment, but pushing it and trying to push it in a more positive direction. And yeah, and the growth question, I mean, I think it's coming more to the fore. I think you'd be laughed out of court for questioning growth even 5 or 10 years ago, but people routinely now talk more about well-being and prosperity and so on. So I do see that the door is open, because it's obviously such a flawed measure for capturing how we want to be as a society or giving us any serious indication of our collective health. So I think that argument is starting to be won, but clearly there's a long way to go, because governments and corporations are hugely committed to it.
That's great, Peter. Okay, let's go to Manisha. And again, just in case any of the questions were wiped out by the momentary freeze earlier, it was top 3 actions for sustainable behavior change. How do we achieve collective shift? How do we grow empathy as a foundation for change? How do we increase awareness of the urgency of change? And that question about GDP.
Great, thank you. So maybe I'll tackle the question about GDP as well as, the urgency, empathy altogether. And I think partially we need to maybe also change how we talk about behavior and the point of consumption. Why do we consume? Why do we do these things? And there's now a growing focus on thinking about needs and the ways in which, starting from the frame of, what are the needs we are satisfying as human beings through our consumption, and having needs be a topic of social dialogue and discussion, leading then into this notion of consumption corridors. As a global society, we already have a sense of, what's the bare minimum that people need to live lives of reasonable dignity. But to also expand that conversation to thinking about upper limits. What are those upper limits to our consumption? And I think tied to this, if we can, and going back to what Peter said, if we can ensure a set of foundational infrastructures, right, water, sanitation, food, transportation, that meet people's inalienable basic needs, and those foundational infrastructures are widely available and accessible to most of the population, then that also opens up room to then say, okay, we have caps, we have rations on things that go beyond those foundational infrastructures. And this is not, an alien concept. When you think about the public schooling system here in the United States, that's really how it works. Public school is freely available to everybody. It's funded through taxpayer money. It's a universally accessible service for the most part. And then private schooling is not thought to be funded or subsidized by the state. Of course, that's become complicated in the neoliberal era, but we do have models, societal models, by which if we ensure a foundational infrastructure for everybody, the conversation to then set caps or limits on private consumption or private overconsumption becomes more realistic and possible to do. And I think this then also enables the concept of empathy to come in, for us to think about, well, what are our shared goals as a global or a national community, and what are the ways in which my overconsumption is actively preventing somebody else from leading a decent life. We haven't really framed the consumption conversation in those terms. I think it would be interesting to see whether it will be effective in terms of pushing more people and bringing more people onto this movement.
Thanks, Manisha. And you gave us another good example of how the United States and the United Kingdom misunderstand each other in the same language, because of course in the UK, public schools are actually private schools, and real public schools are, anyway, that's another one. Right, let's go over to Lewis. Lewis.
Thank you so much. I think I tried a question of the top things to do. Almost every report or analysis makes it very clear, the top areas where we can shift behavior. They talk about shifting from meat consumption to less meat consumption to vegetarian diets, or if you want to push it a little bit more, vegan diet, flying less, or using motorized forms of transportation that are fossil fueled, and getting cozy at home without being overly heating and so on. This is at the individual level. But I'd like to push this a little bit because someone has described sustainability as a crisis management concept. And the reason why we're employing this right now is because of a certain realization that we're hitting the boundaries and we're not necessarily safe getting into the future. And I would say as a society, we're not yet jolted enough, because the impacts of this from an understanding of biophysical sciences, the impacts of this take time to start manifesting in society. And so we're sitting pretty comfortably and talking about it as if it's a storybook, right? So how about jolting each other a little bit? Once we start thinking about things like just looking back at a historical approach of how we've handled large things. I've talked about crisis management concept, maybe looking at an analogy related to a war. During the World War, there was something called rationing, right? So that everyone can get a bit of what is left and it can go around fairly easily. And we put a cap to it, as Manisha said. Once we start talking about carbon rationing, for example, and talking about individual carbon budgets, people tend to sit up. Why? Because you have a limit within which you have to fit your lifestyle. And whether or not you agree, it brings you into the process of finding solutions or beginning to create alternatives to those. But there's also something called choice editing, which has been around for a bit, but people tend to drop it. Especially governments get uncomfortable with this because, as they say, intervention in private decisions is not really them. But we know that governments regulate ownership of arms. Well, maybe not some governments, but at least most countries say you shouldn't have arms as a private citizen. You shouldn't have nuclear material floating around. So they use different criteria, public safety, public health, and so on, to intervene in private consumption or individual choice. And now we have an even much bigger problem, sustainability. If we start using that as a criteria to edit the choices that we have available to us, you would easily argue that governments have a mandate for choice editing. How then do we go about editing this? Whose decision it is and so on is something we need to work out. But a certain jolting of society to recognize just the sheer scale and the challenge here is needed in order to have a large scale conversation and sort of increase the urgency of the transformation.
Thank you, Lewis, very much. And for anybody who's interested in some of those historical examples and precedents, you can find case studies about the history of rationing in wartime and behavior change associated with it on the Rapid Transition website. And an interesting insight, perhaps, is that one of the reasons why rationing rather than taxation was used to change consumption behaviors then was because it was understood to be both fairer, but also much quicker. And reflecting on one of the other questions that was put, the experience of the sort of collective endeavor during that time, certainly in the United Kingdom, laid the foundations for the rapid introduction of the National Health Service afterwards and social housing building programs as well. So let's go to Juliet now.
Thanks. So my top 3 options, and here I'm going to display my training as an economist, are really geared toward changes that will go through the whole system and alter, basic relations. So the first is a robust universal basic income / basic services. The second is a wealth tax. I think that we have a lot of evidence now about how income concentration is highly associated with environmental degradation and emissions in particular. I've done a number of papers showing that countries that have, and also states across the US that have more income concentration or wealth concentration at the top, looking at either top 10, top 5, top 1%, have higher emissions, other things held equal. And then finally, and this is a topic Peter raised, it's really important in the report, basically cleaning up our political system. So I'd say banning private contributions to politicians or whatever the equivalent is in another country to sort of keep politicians accountable to people and not special interest corporations. On the urgency question, I want to agree with Peter's perspective here, which is that equity, the sort of putting equity at the core of the urgency question is exactly what has propelled it in the United States and in other places, because there's much, I think there's just really widespread understanding about how our system is failing, tremendously on issues of equity, and these really matter. We have had people talking about Green New Deals for decades. And in the US, it was not until we got an equity-centric Green New Deal that it actually took off. And I don't think that's an accident. I think it's really key that sort of putting those two things together is the sweet spot for making progress and for getting the kind of urgent action that we need. And I see that, Bill Reese has put something into the chat about time scale, and this equity / environmental or ecological overshoot framing has been the one that has really propelled us rapidly toward change. And finally, I'll just, and here I'm also building on Manisha's point about needs. And this is the GDP question. We've also spent years and years on GDP and really didn't get anywhere with this, all that very far with those efforts. In 2016 in the United States, and I'm sorry to keep referring to my country, but it's the one I know better, with the Bernie Sanders campaign, we had a needs-based agenda rather than a growth-based agenda, which is where most of the progressive economists and policy people had been. It had been like all about growth. Once we got to a focus on needs, what do people need? Healthcare, education, a minimum wage, etc. The discourse shifted really rapidly away from GDP and growth to needs, and it has stayed there, and that's where it needs to be. And it's really fascinating to me that the Green New Deal resolution in the United States says nothing about the rate of growth of GDP. It's all about jobs, education, healthcare, decarbonization. And so this is really key. We got to keep the focus on what we need to change. And I think GDP falls by the wayside.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, Juliet. Now, over to you, Stuart, and then we might have time for another quick round of questions.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so as a psychologist who from a discipline which is certainly guilty of viewing people as individuals, I interpreted the top 3 actions question as things that you could do. I mean, I agree with everything Juliet said. Sometimes I find myself feeling like, but how? What do I do tomorrow to help move these things forward? And so I think, as sort of Lewis suggested, things like flying, eating less meat, consuming less stuff are the things we can do as individuals. And I think there are reasons why those things are important. I mean, flying is becoming a kind of iconic thing, but it's important because, as Peter mentioned, this is something predominantly done by the wealthy, privileged elite, which is having it exemplifies the kind of the unfairness of the polluter elite harming the people with the least in the world. So I think flying less and finding ways to talk about flying less, even if that makes people step 3 paces away from you, is important to do. I think finding ways to be politically engaged is the other thing. So not really anything to do necessarily with your carbon footprint, and that will mean different things to different people. Some people might want to be involved in protest or in supporting groups, but whoever you are and whatever your circumstances, I think it's really important to find ways to be involved in that. And that could be pestering your local councillor about a polluted road, or joining a group to try and set up a school street, or doing something with your family to grow, anything you can do which is somehow trying to change your wider circumstances with other people. Politically with a small p, I think is really important there. So that sort of ties into the collective shift. I think on the empathy point, I agree with Manisha that fairness is at the heart of this, and I think a lot of social science research suggests that people in general are very alert to issues of fairness, whether it's about climate change and climate impacts themselves, or about the measures we need to take to address that. People want a fair world, and you know, we all know climate change is the most unfair, unjust thing there is. So I don't think we should be afraid of drawing attention to that. That, you know, your freedom of choice is somebody else's climate impact. On the awareness and urgency, we've done work within the CAST Centre a couple of times, surveys over the last couple of years, and I've been surprised. I mean, this has been the UK, but the level of awareness and recognition of climate change as an urgent issue is a lot higher than I think many people recognise. I mean, full-on climate deniers are pretty much a dying breed now. People get this. It doesn't mean we still need to get people more engaged, but they get the urgency. People also in our research are pretty supportive of the idea of that as a society we need to limit the amount of flying we do, that we need to sort of consume less stuff. They're a little bit hazier on meat consumption. Maybe that's about kind of the meanings it has for people, but people are pretty much split. People don't want to give up their meat, so that's going to be a tougher battle, I think. And on GDP, yeah, everyone knows we should get rid of it.
Fantastic, Stuart. Okay, I was perhaps being slightly ambitious in terms of how much time we have left. I'm going to mention a couple of the final questions, and I give each of my speakers like a sort of 30-second speed slot to summarize your totality of your understanding of this issue and where we go from here. Not brutal at all. But just before that, my colleague Freddie Daly, who's one of the co-authors of the report, has got a quick poll he would like to do. So if Freddie is there and listening, I'm going to sort of invite you to put it on there it is on the screen. So please, ladies and gentlemen, have a little look at there and mark up on the polling. That'll is only going to, it's marvelous, isn't it? This technology these days. I'm so impressed by that. It's going to give us a snapshot, an interesting snapshot of where everybody's from. So just in our sort of remaining time, just to say, please do read, share, discuss the report and the recommendations, and do get back in touch with Peter and the rest of us if you've got if it inspires any thoughts. As I mentioned before, if your organisation is not already a member of the Rapid Transition Alliance, please do go on the site and sign up. But just as to frame a final 30-second thought from each of our speakers, we had a question in, actually there's one very particular one for Juliet, and that is, does the shift towards home working under COVID, has that been equivalent in any way to the idea of the shorter working week? We also had a question on the classic tension about what is the balance between bottom-up change and top-down change, and also it's kind of been touched on already, but you know, what can we do individually as people who maybe in a former lifetime flew around the world to academic conferences to lower our own carbon footprint in our own lives? So just a quick 30 seconds from each of you, and let's start this time with Manisha.
Thank you. So I think I just want to amplify two things I heard, which is we have to connect the behavior change conversation to the conversation on work. We have to connect the behavior change conversation to the conversation on equity. And bringing these three things together is, I think, a huge part of what this community of thinkers and scholars, many of us polluted elite, can do to push this agenda forward in the coming years.
Fantastic. Let's go to Stuart. You've got to say you're muted.
Yeah, I was on mute. Someone had to try and talk while they're on mute at some point, didn't they? Yeah, so I would say there is no such thing as individual behaviour. Everything we do is part of a complex social, political, economic, historical web, and the more we can appreciate that, the better. I think lifestyle change, behaviour change can be accomplished in many different ways. Sometimes that will be top down if you can get a policymaker to impose a tax or a levy, but sometimes we should feel empowered, whether it's through ourselves or local initiatives, to try and make that change ourselves. Yeah, that'll do.
Fantastic, thank you. Lewis.
I'm thinking one of the biggest fears that people tend to express is that it's all about reductions. And we've painted this world where there's reduced resources, there's a carbon budget and all these things. And what people see is your lives shrinking into a fraction of what the dream that our institutions have peppered them with is. So we owe it to create a vision of a future society that is more convincing and that is positive, that offers an alternative to what we have now. Otherwise, what people see constantly in front of them is just some dark future. Once we create that sort of vision or multiple visions as such of positive futures of shared prosperity, we then need three key ingredients in this. One, firm institutions that reflect and embody what that future vision is. Two, champions and agitators that refuse to accept current norms and that would sort of push us out of our comfort zone towards those. And three, an agitation for a different kind of politics that would hopefully guide us with a sort of moral architecture that better represents who we are as society and humanity.
Beautifully summarized, Lewis. Thank you. Juliet.
Thanks. I'll answer that question about the working from home, and the sort of the top line of this is that carbon accounting is really complicated, and there's a lot of unintended consequences, and it's part of the reason why I think a focus on sort of individual carbon footprints is really not the way to go. But we need to put in those bigger structural forces that sort of force us into lower patterns. So does working from home do the same thing as shorter work weeks? Well, here's what we'd have to consider. Number one, the change in commuting patterns, but number two, the fact that we have a lot of distributed energy use in all of those homes, whereas before we had centralized energy use in a workplace, typically more efficient. The other thing is, are people buying less because they're working at home? So for example, apparel, which is a pretty high impact product. So yes, we might be gaining on that. We're also probably gaining a bit on household cooking, but then again, there you have also that distributed, decentralized versus centralized prepared food where you have more efficient energy use. So I don't know. And it'll be interesting to, we'll get studies out on this going forward, I think, but it does suggest how complicated taking that individual household footprinting approach and putting that at the sort of at the center of what you're trying to do. And that's one of the reasons I really love this report, because it sort of put the individual behavior change into that larger systemic perspective, which is absolutely necessary if we're going to really make progress. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. And again, that's a really good reminder that any process of change has unpredictable and emergent properties, and that paths are made by walking, and we have to think as we go. Let's go to Peter.